The story you are about to hear is an amazing account of Swedish missionaries who traveled from Stockholm to Xinjiang, China, to take the gospel to the Turkic Muslims, or Uyghur people, in the deserts of eastern Turkestan. The work spanned more than 40 years, ending in 1938, when the last missionaries were escorted to the border by armed guards. And yet, the story does not end there. The legacy of the work, and of those who sacrificed to take the gospel to the Uyghurs, is recaptured through the eyes of the remnant. Margareta Hook-Wenfers met recently with Becky Watt of Run Ministries to relate the story of her own family's journey to Kashgar and beyond during the 1930s.
Margareta, when did you first become interested in recapturing your mother's story? How did that begin?
Well, of course, I grew up with this story. When I was a child, my parents had been in India after Eastern Turkestan. Of course, nowadays you say Xinjiang, but I grew up with Eastern Turkestan. And it was such a natural part of my life, meeting the old missionaries from there. And sometimes my mother would tell a little bit about what things and the caravan journeys. But really, I prepared myself to become a missionary doctor, and I worked, as you know, in Nepal. And it was during the autumn of 1981, when I was just having my ordinary prayer session. I was all alone. The Lord gave me a very strong feeling that I should do something to encourage the Christians, the old Christians that still might be alive from the days of the Swedish mission.
Tell me about your mother and father. What took them to Eastern Turkestan? What was their background? What drew them there?
My father grew up in northern Sweden. He grew up in a very warmly Christian home, a loving and caring home. And they belonged to this Swedish Mission Church, or Covenant Church. And there were missionaries in Eastern Turkestan from that area. And I have no recording how my father felt the calling, but he must have done it when he was quite young, because he started his missionary training at the age of 21 or so, at this training college here in this very town of Lidingö. So he had this definite calling for Eastern Turkestan. And my mother, she had become a nurse, and she came to this missionary training college, Missionsskolan in Swedish we say. And she had felt a calling to be a missionary, and she thought she was going to Congo. And then there is a silence for a long time in her diary, and then it comes much later, and she says, "My life has changed. I met Ivar, and he is going to Turkestan, and I'm going also." And they married in this lovely church in the south of Sweden, in my mother's home church. And the day after the marriage, I think it was on a Saturday, and on the Sunday there was this dedication service, and on the third day they left for Turkestan by train down to Genoa through Europe. This was 1931 in August. Then they took the boat, a big steamer in Genoa, through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, over the Indian Ocean to Bombay. And from Bombay, they went by train through India up to Rawalpindi. And from there, by bus to Srinagar. And there they stayed for some weeks. They were a group of missionaries. They stayed there to organize the caravan. You sort of rented or leased. You can say, like you lease a car these days, you leased a caravan, maybe with 30 caravan horses, with a caravan man, everything, to carry the packing and the people. And when they got that all organized, they also had to buy some sheep so that they had some meat for the journey and all the food they needed. And so they started on the caravan route, which that time, there were 3 different routes to choose between. That time they went Actually, there was not a real choice. It was the one that was open they had to take. And that was the very difficult one, Leh Ladakh, a little bit more to the east in the Himalayas, than a shorter route over Gilgit. So it was a 7 weeks horse ride across the Himalayas. When they had put up their tent somewhere very high, it snowed, and they were snowed in for 3 days. And they had seen many dead horses along the road. They knew it was a real danger of life. If you didn't get on going, you could freeze to death in these heights. And the animals, sometimes they couldn't walk because it seems they got mountain sickness. And my mother told how they would tie the eyes of the horse like that, so that when the horse didn't see, then he would walk on. He wouldn't be so frightened anymore. So again and again in her diary, she'd say, "Thank you, Lord, you helped us, you kept us, we got through this difficulty." And she would also describe how it was moonlight and they were riding, how they were singing. They were singing Christmas songs, though it was not Christmas. She seemed to enjoy it, I think she'd only been riding a little bit as a child on horseback. They didn't give them any horse riding classes in the missionary training college.
After a brief honeymoon and the long, dangerous 7-week trip across the Himalayas, Ivar and Elizabeth Hook reached their destination of Yarkand.
The Swedish work had already begun in Yarkand? Were they meeting a team of people there?
Yes. They were relieving also. Some people were going home, So actually it seems that they started to work, like the day after they'd arrived, they started to work in the hospital, the mission hospital in Yarkand.
So were both your mother and father working in that hospital?
Yes, they did. My mother was a trained nurse. My father, he had 5 years in this missionary training college, so he was like both a pastor trained and a missionary trained. And then in those days, late 1920s, early 30s, all missionaries had to spend 1 year in something called Livingston Medical College in London, where they learned basics of medicine and a little bit of surgery. So my father, he was called a doctor, but there was no qualified doctor, neither among the Uyghurs or among the missionaries. The missionaries of those days were very keen to learn the language. That was a must. And they would have both elder missionaries as teachers as local people. And for my mother, we have a beautiful picture where one young girl from the girls' home, Mirza, is teaching her.
Tell us about the work that the mission did. What type, the orphanages and the hospitals?
In Yarkand, they had this hospital, and they also had a girls' home and a boys' home. And in fact, they had been working there since the 1890s, so a very long time. And my parents were put in the hospital, and actually it seemed that there was one other missionary there also, and the others went home, so they were really thrown into the work.
Now let's talk about those early days. What does she describe when she sees this place and the people? Do you recall?
Yes, she describes such a joy. In fact, somebody of the Uyghur workers at the mission, one of the hospital workers, he came riding to meet them. And she's just so thrilled when she writes in her diary to see one Uyghur Christian coming, or a Turk. They would call them Turks, in those days. So she was all thrilled to pieces. I can see that through her book there is such a love for the people. So the Lord really must have touched her and given her her own calling also for Turkestan in some way.
The mission was in 3 different cities at that time. Do you think that's right?
Yarkand and Kashgar, and they were also in a city called Yengi Hasar. I don't remember which year they started that.
Uyghur people, how were their lives impacted by Swedish ways? Did they teach them agriculture or health or anything that they...
They taught them particularly health. And in the school for orphan children, boys and girls, they would teach them all subjects. And because the mission had this printing press in Kashgar, they printed the textbooks in biology, in physics, every subject, geography. They had Uyghur textbooks for the children. And they were also taught in the printing press work, all that type. They were very clever Uyghurs who ran this printing press. And in fact, Gunnar Jarring, who has been a Swedish ambassador, peace mediator in the Middle East also, he has been always very interested in the Uyghur language and also in the Swedish mission. And he's written a book telling about every book that has been printed by the Swedish mission in Kashgar and what that printing press meant for the rate of literacy in that part. Gunnar Jarring, whom I mentioned, he was young and he was studying in Lund in the south of Sweden. He was studying linguistics, languages, and one of his lecturers happened to be the Swedish missionary Raket, who was such a linguist that he got a high position at this university after he'd been many years in Turkestan, and he wrote a grammar in Uyghur, and he was then working at this university institution, and he encouraged Gunnar Jarring to do his doctorate in Uyghur. And Gunnar Jarring went along with the missionaries on the caravan, and this time it was also through Russia and the Pamir Mountains, and he stayed for a year with the mission to study language, and he was seriously ill during that time, and they cared for him very lovingly, and he was always so thankful to the people for that and kept in touch all over the years. And now when he's going to be 90 this autumn, and he is in his old age continuing his work with the Uyghur language from old literature.
Perhaps the last living Westerner with first-hand knowledge of the Swedish mission work in eastern Turkestan is former Swedish diplomat and Uyghur language and culture scholar, Mr. Gunnar Jarring. Becky spoke with him by telephone from his home in southern Sweden.
I felt that all what the missionaries did ought to be known outside the missionary circles, not only with people who are connected with missionary work.
Gunnar Jarring's respect for the Swedish mission's work among Uyghurs aided in the establishment of the Friend collection of historical photos and documents now preserved in the Swedish National Archives in Stockholm. Turning again to the Hook family, Margareta continues the account of her parents' lives and ministry in eastern Turkestan.
Now, can you tell that story about when she became pregnant?
Well, of course, she was very happy about this, but she was also very weak and tired, and she had to rest, and then there was a revolution. It was unrest in the country and persecution of Christians. It was in 1933 that one of the Christian Uyghurs was shot to death, Habil. Some missionaries, they tied them to poles in order to shoot them, but miraculously they were let free. And this was at a time when that present ruler was, he started the Republic of Turkestan, something like that. But somebody then came from the British consulate and said, "What do you think people in the world will think if you start your country, your republic, by killing foreigners?"
The turbulent political crisis and resulting persecution of 1933 cost the life of 19-year-old Habil, the first martyr of the Swedish mission's work in eastern Turkestan.
This is the hymn book of Habil the martyr. It was very tragic how he was arrested and killed in Yarkand. When they came and just took somebody, and they took Habil, and they asked him to deny his faith several times. And he said, "No, I will not do that." 3 times, I think, they gave him the option. And then one of the bodyguards, or whoever it was of that ruler, took out his sword and killed him. And they threw Habil's body out on the street. The dogs, who usually would just get on anything dead and eat it, they didn't touch Habil's body. So eventually it had to be buried, which was a sign for the people. So the mission decided that the women should go home. So not only my mother, but also other women, they wanted them to leave the field.
She left your father, though. Tell about how she had to leave him and how he...
Yeah, and my father and also another male missionary whose wife and 2 children left at the same time. The 2 of them, they rode on horseback for 2 days, it was, with their wives in this caravan, and then they had to turn back. And of course, they didn't know if they would meet again, because this was a very tense and difficult time. Strangely enough, the road across to the Soviet Union was open. It had been open in the early years of the mission, but after 1917, the Russian Revolution, that road was closed. And the mission had to send their people all around through India. So instead of a 2 or 3 weeks journey, it became a 3 months journey to reach Turkestan. But now, 1933, they were allowed to travel across the Pamir Mountains, which would take 14 days, and then by truck and bus and train to Moscow, Leningrad, Helsinki, and by boat to Stockholm. So that would take about 3 weeks in all. So this was the tour my mother took home. Only 3 days after she arrived in Stockholm, she was standing on the church steps at the Emmanuel Church in Stockholm, one of the big Mission Covenant churches. And she says the waters went. So she was rushed to the hospital for delivery, and she delivered Gunnar. And it seems they must have decided upon the name, because he was called Gunnar from the beginning. And she writes her joy of holding the baby and how she wished that her husband Ivar also could have hold the baby in his arms. About a year later, there was a letter, a telegram came from Xinjiang. Send out, and 4 missionaries were mentioned. Elisabeth Höök, one of them. And she got this message, and suddenly, actually it seems that she had not been thinking of going back, that she should stay with Gunnar in Sweden. But when this telegram came, she started to really pray, and she writes how happy she is that she had some 2 days on her own with Gunnar. Nothing else was planned, and she could pray, and she felt within herself that she should go back, that she should say yes to this call. But that would mean leaving Gunnar. And actually the mission in Sweden did not put any pressure on her. They let her choose, If she had decided to stay, they would have accepted that. But in those days, you did not take your small children with you. That was the policy. You left them in a missionary children's home, here at Lidingö also, 2 homes they had near each other. Because so many of the small children died on the mission field. And even in Turkestan, there are these graves of babies, small children. So the decision to return to the work and to my father, it meant leaving Gunnar. And she writes, how my heart is torn. All through, she's thinking of Gunnar. How could it be with Gunnar? But when they came, when she traveled to London and from London across by boat through at Gibraltar, and then they went up somewhere in Italy, and there some other missionaries joined the ship, and there were letters waiting for them, one from Sweden then, telling about Gunnar, and so onwards to Bombay. So she would have some message along. Like in Bombay, I think also there was a message about Gunnar. But then, of course, on the caravan road, they went the Gilgit route. So, and that took 5 weeks. It took all 3 months, but those 5 weeks, of course, she didn't hear anything.
Did she go then to Yarkand when she went
No,
back?
because in the meantime, my father had been transferred to Kashgar. This is Kashgar, as it looked in those days. And I heard it's very similar even now. This one we can look at, it's outside the mission hospital. My father is sitting there on a little bridge because there were water irrigation canals. And during that time, you know, so many people were wounded, both soldiers and local people. And we have had a little box full of small, not bullets, but it was sort of any metal things which they would put into the arms. And my father took that out of people.
So this unrest was Muslim against Muslim conflict?
Yes. But, you know, there was influence both from Chinese and Russian in it. But it was Muslim against Muslim.
However, at the end of 1934, relative calm returned to the region, and the growth of the mission and the Hook family continued.
But your mother had other children.
Yes, when she then came back again to Turkestan, then she had a miscarriage, and then she got pregnant with my sister Marianne, and she was born in Kashgar in May 1936. So then my father could hold his baby in his arms.
At that time, it was peaceful time.
That was a very peaceful time.
They're in Kashgar. And what's happening with the Uyghurs? Is there a church? Are there believers?
There had been, you know, at times one and one came to the Lord. But there were also times when several would come to the Lord at the same time. And also a time of revival among these Christians that, you know, they got deeper in their faith, they confessed their sins and wanted to walk closer with the Lord. And so the church matured all the time. So my parents were taking active part, but they were Uyghur evangelists, maybe not anybody who they would call a pastor, but evangelists serving in the church all the time. And of course missionaries would also be preaching along with their work. So this work went on all the time, and they say that for this whole period, which is a long, from 1892 to 1938, maybe 300 Uyghurs became Christian. That sounds very little, but that was very much for any mission among Muslims in those days. But the mission, several times you can see how the mission thinks that they're not doing a good enough job. People are not getting converted in enough numbers, and they were thinking that they should, stop this mission. And so they were having these discussions. In 1937, in the autumn of 1937, it was the time planned for my parents to go home. It was not because of any unrest or so, but they and a group of missionaries should go on home leave. And the closest road across Russia was closed, so they had to go and over the Himalayas, and they got permission to go over Gilgit, which was unusual. Only 5 caravans with missionaries all over the years could go via Gilgit. And the Gilgit route was 5 weeks, and the Leh Ladakh route was 7 weeks. So they came across Gilgit, and on that journey Marianne was with them. She was about 18 months old. And sometimes she was sitting in a box. Side of the horse there would be some burden, some luggage, and on the other side there was this box with Marianne. I can see it here on the picture. And the horses were trained so that they would walk on the edge of the mountain path, the steep path, because then the inner box would just touch the mountain wall, or not touch it, just enough space. But the outer box would be outside over the steep of the valley. So it was frightening. But the horses just stepped on, and there would be a caravan man leading the horse also in front. At times, a caravan man would carry Marianne. At times, she would be sitting in front of my father or mother. You know, they would hold her, but not too much, because that was felt unsafe. You know, it was safer if she was on a box or tied to a caravan man.
Tell us about these caravan men. Were they Uyghur?
They were a mixture of people, but mainly Uyghurs, yes. But they could be from the Indian side as well, because some caravans, they started from India and went up, and then they went back, so it was both. They came to England, and they stayed for a couple of weeks in England, actually, because there were some relatives, and they had to wait also for the boat to take them across to Gothenburg. And then from Gothenburg they went by train up to Stockholm and could meet with Gunnar, and that was in December 1937. Gunnar was almost 5 years old when he saw his father for the first time. And of course then when they came home, they took little Gunnar with them to the home where they were staying. And Gunnar was weeping and said, "I want to go home." And he meant the children's home. And my mother said, "Oh, how my heart wept when I hear my son say he wants to go home. And we are home." My mother was pregnant with me at that time. Very early pregnancy, because I was born in July the year after. So I'm so happy that I can say that I was made in Kashgar.
The Great Persecution of 1938 was just ahead. Uyghurs with any contact with foreigners were suspect and accused of being traitors to the new regime. This time, revolution brought severe persecution against all Uyghur believers, costing the lives of most of the men and boys, while the girls were subjected to imprisonment and attempts to force them to return to Islam.
And it's sad to think that these are those, when they grew up a bit, were killed in the persecution, particularly the men and the older boys, and the women and the older girls were given to the soldiers in 1938.
The missionaries, when persecution came, did they try to stay throughout and they were forced to leave?
They were forced to leave. Oh yes, and the main persecutions came only after they had left. I mean, they were already in like a house arrest. And at times they hardly got water. They were not allowed to go and buy food. And it's very touching stories how the Christians would risk their life, the Uyghur Christians, to bring food to the missionaries, because they were not allowed to go out. And the mission was watched by soldiers. And even some boys, they crept through some little water canal leading into the mission compound. And they came, they were quite young, and they said, "Please baptize us. You are not going to be allowed to stay in the country, but please baptize us before you leave." And they were baptized there. And then they disappeared. And so the women, there were still some women there, this was in 1938, and they were sent home by the caravan. And so 3 missionaries stayed on to watch the mission compound and things, and they were still hoping that it would be peace again, so that the mission could work on and the missionaries all come back. But then they were expelled from the country. And when things were getting tighter and tighter, they themselves destroyed all documents so that nothing from their papers would harm any of the Uyghur Christians. And then they were escorted by soldiers to the border. But miraculously, the New Testament manuscripts, the translation manuscripts they had in their boxes, that meant the end of the Swedish mission in Turkestan. Of course, they didn't know from the beginning, so that's why they waited. I think they would have returned in 1939, but they were waiting to see if they could go to Turkestan, but the troubles went on. So the Swedish mission decided to take up work in India among Muslims, and in fact they wanted to reach Uyghurs in India. They were refugees in northern India, and they wanted to continue with the Bible translation work in India also. So in early 1940, the first group of missionaries left for India. My parents were among them. And then I was also with them, and Gunnar and Marianne, we all went to India together. So I have not been to Eastern Turkestan yet. I'm waiting for my time to go there, but I spent my childhood years in India.
Speaking with Margareta later in the day, she shared materials printed by the mission.
The whole Bible was completed after the missionaries had gone to India. So they continued to work on the Bible translation in India. And this is the whole Bible printed in Cairo in 1950. 1950. And this is, of course, a treasure. There are very few of this. And I went to the Bible Society in Delhi once to ask if they had got any, and they said if we would have had any left here, the white ants would have eaten them all.
Margareta recalls the witness of the lives of both missionaries and Uyghur believers, and the lasting imprint their sacrifices have made. Tornissa, raised by the missionaries, suffered greatly during the persecution. After 30 years of silence from Eastern Turkestan, the arrival of her letter in Sweden signaled Christianity's ongoing existence among Uyghurs.
She was in prison in the beginning of the 1940s. That was after the mission had left. They took her and they didn't tell why they had arrested her, and she was in jail in this terrible prison for 2 years, and for 1 year she was in a room where there was no light. It took 1 more year before she came out of prison. But at that time, when she was released, they thought she was going to die. So they thought it was better get her out of the prison before she died. But she was lying, I think, for 6 months and then eventually recovered. But when she got well, this is, she tells very firmly, she went to the office, the city office, to find out why she'd been put in jail. Because there had never been any trial. There was nothing. She didn't know. Okay, now there were new rulers. They were more friendly. They got the books out and they found her name and they found what she was. The sentence against her was brought up by the Swedish mission. But anyway, Tornissa, she never spoke a bad word about the mission. She loved the mission. She loved the Swedes. You would think she would be bitter, but she was angry more with the authorities.
And what about her walk with the Lord? What happened during those years?
She always went on walking with the Lord. And everybody was, those who survived were, dispersed. Mm-hmm. Like these women, they had been given away to the soldiers, many of them. And they didn't know about each other. But they came back, some of them. Many died. But some of them would come back to their hometown, Kashgar or Yarkand. And after some years, they started to find each other and they started to meet. And Tunisa, she was the leader of a group of women who met all these years. And they would sing hymns, they would read Bible portions, but they had not one piece of scripture because everything had been burnt. They had no hymn books. But they remembered. They knew by heart. So how they sang, and I've heard Tunisa sit on buses in Pakistan where I met her later, or in Sweden when she visited, and she would sit and sing and sing and sing by heart, you know, verse after verse after verse.
She is the woman who wrote. Tell us about that.
Tunisa had for years been thinking of her, what she called her mother. And with her mother, she meant the Swedish missionaries, her mothers, in this children's girls' home. And she wanted to get in touch with them. And so she wrote a letter in 1967. And with fear for her life and situation, she went to the post office in Yarkand. This was during the Cultural Revolution, you know. But she had decided she was going to send this letter. And she had written Swedish Mission, Sweden. No name, no proper address. And the letter was sent. And it came to Sweden. And it went to this Swedish mission office and that mission office. But the letter was written in Turkey, in Uyghur, you know. So when it got to the Svenska Missionsförbundets office in Stockholm, of course they recognized this. And she's writing, like I've read this many times, that first letter. And she writes like this: like as the trees of the Himalayas are evergreen, so is your love, Mother, your love for me is evergreen in my heart. Are you still alive? And one of her mothers was alive. The one she was thinking particularly of had died. But that's how the missionaries started to write back. And from 67 till she came to Sweden in 85, this correspondence was going on. She would write her letters to me in this Roman script. She would try to visit, of course, all the living missionaries. I think there were 6 when Tunisa came. But also she wanted to visit the graves of all the missionaries she had met. So we traveled across Sweden and went to all these churchyards to find the graves, and people helped us, of course. And when she was standing there at the grave, she would always tell something about this person, what they'd been working with, appreciating their work. And then she spoke in many, many churches.
She died when?
1991. That's the year when Tunisa died in April, Jacob Stephen died and my mother died both in September. And they are the last 3 from that mission time.
You have met Uyghur Christians other places. How has that been for you?
Oh, that was a tremendous encouragement. Oh, I didn't know. I wasn't expecting to meet Uyghur Christians, and I could speak to them a little bit, and they didn't know the history of the Swedish mission. They didn't know there had been Christians in Xinjiang in earlier days. I had a feeling that they felt as if they had found their roots, and their faith was nothing strange and new. It had been there before.
Uyghurs today are largely unaware of the gospel the Swedes labored to take to them. And yet, given opportunity to hear of his love for them, Uyghurs have responded to Christ. Let not the blood of the martyrs cry out in vain for others to return, bringing life-giving waters to the desert towns of Xinjiang.
درجة خانده اعتقاد داشته سمای جمالیله یکسلده عیسی مسیح که شان شهرت بولسın ota xudoga shukrlar bo'lsin amin